thank you for coming out. It's a pretty intense time out in the world right now. But first, before we begin, I would like to welcome to our speakers, to our guests, to the media, to those who are attending online. Thank you for making some time for us. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that the traditional custodians of this land are the traditional owners of this land. We pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And we do extend respect to Aboriginal and Torres Island Strait people attending today, if you are here. Thank you. A warm welcome on a cold day, or at least a rainy day, to launch Australian Cyber Week for 2022. This is a very exciting period for us. We've got a whole week's worth of activities coming. It is the first time that we have launched Cyber Week on the back of the release of AustCyber's Sector Competitiveness Plan. We're really excited to bring to you 5 days of programming, content, and discussion around the key insights that formed out of that Sector Competitiveness Plan. It's the first time that plan has come to you from the combined Stone and Chalk group, including both Stone and Chalk and AustCyber. We're reminded daily by the events in the headlines of the need for cybersecurity and vigilance in the country. There's never been a more important time to be on top of it than there is right now. To explore the full breadth of the industry, the ecosystem, and what we can do and the capability here in Australia, there's nothing more important. The coming week will be packed. We will have a ton of activities and events all across the country. This is the first time we are both live and live streaming at the same time, and we have events happening in all of our hubs in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide. We'll be out in Perth and in Canberra as well at our other facilities there. So this truly is a national Cyber Week, and that's really exciting because it is a national concern, and it's something we need to take very seriously. Cyber Week's all about giving you the opportunity to learn, but also to network, talk to others, hear from people who know more than you, and to listen and to teach. It's all about getting together and being more innovative about how we protect the country. This year we have two special mentions, two call-outs. One, as I mentioned, the Sector Competitiveness Plan. It's very exciting for us to be able to launch that today. So if you haven't seen it yet, I believe there's a QR code on the little cards in front of you. It's in most of the press, hopefully, this morning. And it's really exciting because I think it's going to have an impact on the cyber industry and the ecosystem for the next several years to come. And as the Stone and Chalk Group CEO, I'm really excited that it brings together the innovation community that Stone and Chalk has created and the cyber community that AustCyber has created, and brings these together to make us all stronger. And now, for our opening keynote address, I don't think there's really anybody else in the country who's right for this job. There's nobody else we could have here today. In 2022, Claire O'Neill was appointed Minister for Home Affairs and for Cybersecurity. And this is a really important thing because we never had a Minister for Cybersecurity before, and that's pretty exciting. She was elected to federal parliament in 2013 and represents the electorate of Hotham here in Melbourne's southeast. Previously appointed across various shadow ministries, including justice, financial services, innovation, technology and the future of work, and as well as senior Australians and aged care services. Those are things that are near and dear to the Stone and Chalk Group heart. Innovation is about bringing multiple sectors and multiple perspectives together, and I think we have a minister who has done that, and that is really exciting. Prior to joining Parliament, she served as an advisor to the Office of the Commonwealth Treasurer and worked as a consultant with CEOs across Australia in key industries, including mining, manufacturing, banking, and retail. The minister was previously elected to the Greater Dandenong Council, and a year later was actually elected mayor. She has a law degree from Monash University and studied in my two hometowns, both Boston, where she was at Harvard, and New York City, where I was born, and worked at the New York Stock Exchange. The minister has a special interest in economics, Indigenous Australia, and the welfare of children. With such an extensive background, we are so delighted today to have Minister Claire O'Neill launch our Cyber Week proceedings. Welcome, Minister.
Thank you, Michael. It's so nice to be here. I just want to reiterate the welcome to country that Michael did there. We're on Wurundjeri land today. And I always like to think about and talk about our Indigenous traditional owners, especially when I do innovation events. We are so lucky in Australia to have as the foundation of our culture and history 60,000 years of Aboriginal ownership and thriving community on this land. You don't survive for 60,000 years without having to constantly shift and change what you do. And the great innovators are the people that were here before us, and I want to acknowledge any Indigenous Australians who are here with us today. And I want to thank Stone and Chalk. I've been a visitor to your Sydney premises, but not to your premises here in Melbourne, so it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for hosting this opening event for Australian Cyber Week. We as an Australian government are very proud to support this event, and I want to commend the 4th Sector Competitiveness Plan report that will shape all of the discussion that happens throughout this week. I think some really important work has been done there. And I think I'll just start by stating the obvious, and that is that Cyber Week could not have come at a more opportune moment for our country. We have just had the 2 biggest cyber attacks that we've ever experienced as a nation within the space of 3.5 weeks. No 2 cyber events are the same, but I think these 2 particularly highlighted the enormous costs that come from us not paying enough attention to this problem as a country. We had with Optus something which exposed literally millions of Australians to identity theft, without question a significant national security risk for our country. And then, of course, with Medibank, really the worst possible information that you can take about people probably is their personal health information. And to have that stolen, I think, more than anything, has just shown us what a costly thing this is to our country and to our citizens to have not had due attention on this problem. So even before all these incidents occurred, I think the Australian government recognised that we do need to bring greater focus and attention. And that's why one of the first things that the government did when it was elected in May was, for the first time, appoint a standalone cabinet minister with responsibility for cybersecurity. And they gave me that role. And there is a big job ahead of us all as the people in this room who are going to drive a lot of change here. I think the 2 incidents that have occurred here will without question drive a permanent change to how our country thinks about cybersecurity. And I think for the first time, we're not going to have that consistent problem that we've had, I think, around boardroom tables, but around kitchen tables too, that this is an issue that's important and that we've all got responsibilities. We've all got responsibilities to change too and do things differently. And that's going to mean change at the big Australian companies around that boardroom level, and also as individuals thinking about how we look after our own data. So one of the things that I think everyone should be able to see here is that an enormous amount has actually already shifted in this last 3 months. In fact, I'm really confident that we have seen greater change in cybersecurity within the federal government over the last 3 months than we did in the preceding 3 years. So I want to just speak about a few of the things that have changed. One of them is that we have literally, out of Optus and Medibank, built a new model of policing. And this is a partnership between the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Federal Police. Of course, these 2 organisations have worked together before, but in Optus and then 3 weeks later in Medibank, they really have started a new model of working together. They are using something called the best athlete principle, which means that these 2 organisations each have their own powers, their own skills, their own partnerships around police force and intelligence agencies around the world. And they can seamlessly use whoever is best positioned to undertake certain parts of their investigation and activities between the 2 organisations. So what the Australian government is doing is building out that model of policing. We are making it permanent. We are putting at least 100 people who will sit within this team, partly co-located at the Australian Signals Directorate. Something else that's different about the work that will be done here is that it won't be reactive to crimes that are committed against Australian citizens. This team will actually hunt around the world for the groups that are likely to do Australians damage and make sure that they debilitate their efforts before they can even come onto our shores here in Australia. It's going to be a really important part. There's no silver bullet in cybersecurity, all of you guys know that, but this is going to be a really important part of our efforts here. And it will do 2 things. The first is, of course, it will weaken these groups, and that's something that, as you all know, we're working really closely with international partners on. But the second thing it will do is show that there is a cost to coming after us here in Australia. So this is part of our country punching back. If you come and try to hurt our citizens, then we are going to come after you. And I think this puts people really on notice about what the costs will be for those groups when they target Australians. So the first thing is this new model of policing, but I did want to mention something that didn't get a great deal of coverage when it happened about 2 weeks ago, and that is that Australia has just become designated the leader of a global ransomware task force. So this is a group of 37 countries around the world who are all concerned about and experiencing ransomware attacks, and Australia is actually going to coordinate and lead that group. We're having our first meeting early next year. And that will help us really collaborate between groups of countries that are concerned about these things. The reason that we're doing that is because all of you know this, but for people watching at home, the same ransomware groups the same cyber criminals are attacking countries around the world. So it's not just Australia that's been the subject of some of these groups. So we do need to have that international focus and approach, and it's really important for us to push and drive that globally. You'll notice that we've introduced new laws into Parliament that will make changes to the penalties that are faced by companies that haven't properly protected the cybersecurity of Australians. And we have essentially also built a cyber response function in the Australian government that, much to my frustration, didn't actually exist before. And we've done all that while we've, I think, managed the response to Optus and the response to Medibank. But I know, and you guys know, that there is a lot more that we need to do here. And in fact, I think there's some really big, important, thorny policy questions that probably we could have been working on in previous years that we are now going to have a big opportunity to address. So one of the very topical questions that's on everyone's mind at the moment is about the data that Australian companies hold about that, and really seeing that, I think, for the first time as a real potential vulnerability for our country. Data is, of course, incredibly important and valuable in this digital age, and our startup sector, more than anyone, needs to have clear rules governing how it can be used. But I think for the first time we've really understood as a broad country and community that this also creates a problem for us when companies are harbouring huge amounts of data, and we do need to have a discussion about what that right trade-off is between the economic development needs and the privacy, very legitimate privacy concerns that Australians have. So we're exploring that question through a privacy review that the Attorney General is conducting at the moment. There are real issues with the critical infrastructure work that has been done over a period of time. So you might have seen that I've commented previously that the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, which is meant to be the be-all and end-all of cybersecurity management in Australia, actually has not been useful to us at all with the cyber attacks that we've experienced recently. And so there's some real work to be done here to understand why this law, which says on the package that it's meant to provide us with all the solutions, when it actually came to the crunch time, it didn't provide us with the help that we needed. We need to have a discussion about ransomware payments, about how we're going to regulate this. This is clearly becoming a pervasive question for Australian business, and we've got to work together within the cybersecurity industry, government and business to understand how we're going to properly monitor and focus on what's going on there. So the approach of the government so far, we've got to act urgently on a bunch of these things, and the list that I've mentioned there are things that the Australian government has actually already done in this past 8 weeks or so. These bigger questions are going to be addressed in the cyber strategy for Australia, which I announced that we would essentially redo, and we will do that over the course of about the next 8 months. I think some of you in this room would have been engaged with the development of the previous cyber strategy for Australia, it's really important that we have a cyber strategy for the country. I think things are moving so quickly in cybersecurity that when you read that strategy now, it lacks a little bit of ambition. And if there's one thing I want for us for cybersecurity in Australia, it's to be ambitious. I actually genuinely believe that Australia can be the most cyber-safe country in the world, but if we're going to get there, some big things are going to have to change, and the cyber strategy is how we're going to set down that agenda and work through it together. If we do reach that goal of Australia being the most cyber-secure country in the world, it is going to be in very large part because of the people in this room. One of the things that can get lost about cybersecurity is that it's in and part of everything that we do, and that can make it hard to manage. But one of the really important aspects of this policy agenda that we have is industry development. Cybersecurity is a critical part of our digital economy. It is a critical part of our sovereign capability. And for that reason, we're going to need to do some work together to understand how I can support you and how the Australian government can support you to grow and build your businesses. I think there's actually a lot of opportunity here. A big part of my job is managing risks and trying to stop terrible things from happening, but this is a good question. I want to work with you guys to talk about how we can build great jobs for Australians, how we can get these firms to be world leading so that you can go and export your products around the world. And that's a great challenge for us to work on together. Just if you're interested, and I know we'll talk about this in the months to come, but a lot of my background has been in questions about economic development. And I'm very interested in the work of an Italian economist, Mariana Mazzucato. Some of you will No, I'm seeing a few nods around the room. But one of the things that Mariana Mazzucato is very big on is the way that we can use regulation to drive best practices in our nascent industries. And this is something that I'm really thinking about in cybersecurity. How can we create world-leading laws that will give you bigger opportunities to grow and develop your businesses? And I'm looking forward to talking to you a bit more about that question. So what is really great about this is that we are starting from a really strong position. And the Sector Competitiveness Plan makes that really clear. We have already got 47,000 people in Australia today in dedicated cybersecurity roles and an additional almost 100,000 people who are working in cyber-related roles. We've got a cyber sector contributing an estimated $2.4 billion to GDP in 2022, which is a pretty significant increase on the previous year. And so these are all very important, and this report that has been done on this is cool. But what I want to say is it's the energy and the vibrancy and the excitement that I get from the sector that is making me so excited about this. There is just so much enthusiasm for how good we can be as a country at this, and that just gets me thrilled. So I'm very excited. And so I just wanted to close by saying what a great opportunity Australian Cyber Week is. And I've had a look at the agenda and there is just so much going on here. I know that the Australian Signals Directorate coming on to talk to you later today. These people are absolute guns and I love every minute that I have working with them. The Deputy Prime Minister and I are very lucky to work closely with this organisation and they're just fantastic. You've got RMIT coming and the Australian Women in Security Net talking to you as well. And so I just want to finish by saying how thrilled I am to be here. We've got a really important mandate for change coming out of what's happened with our country, and I'm so excited about the next 3 years in which we'll be able to work on some of these really critical problems together. So thanks for having me, everyone, and I'd like to formally launch Oz Cyber Week. Thanks.
You can't get it any straighter than that, and that's what we need. Straight talk and straight action. That is what it's all about. And the Sector Competitiveness Plan is a plan for that. It gives you the information, the starting point, and some insight as to where we need to go and where we need to do. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that plan, what it's all about. Hopefully you've all started to take a look at that and you'll have some time over the next week to continue to look through it. But I'm really excited about our fourth plan. As it's our flagship publication, it is the thing that drives our entire year throughout AusCyber. It's designed to help shape, inform, and help grow the sector, grow the industry, grow the ecosystem. I like to talk about the fact that you absolutely have to grow from the top down and from the bottom up. AusCyber remains committed to being a player in that space, to contributing to the outcomes that we're all trying to commit to here today. Startups, scale-ups, corporates, governments, and just individuals who are interested in protecting themselves and their families. It's all relevant to everybody. We like to talk about cybersecurity as an industry, but it really is all industries. I like to tell people you're either in cybersecurity or you're about to find out you're in cybersecurity, and hopefully not the hard way. The most pressing time we've ever had is now. The most pressing time is the time to act. So it's really about doing something differently. And it's great to hear the minister talking about changes. Those 3 critical changes that we're seeing, I think are really important. I think it's really exciting that we're going on the offensive, that we're going out and proactively looking to attack the attackers so that we can weaken their strengths and, of course, make our defenses stronger. What we interestingly saw, however, over the course of the pandemic in the last few years is that lots more digitization and digitalisation meant lots more cyber attack opportunities and vectors. So while we were growing and becoming a more digital nation, we are also becoming a more vulnerable digital nation. And so while we see the cybersecurity industry growing over those 2 or 3 years during the pandemic, we're now starting to see things pull back to probably a more normal state, but we've got to be careful. That kind of complacency is exactly what the criminals are looking for. So we have to actually continue to step up our game. And I think there are 2 key takeaways that I'd like everyone to understand. One is that digitalization, or that period of time, helped realize and increase productivity, but not everybody took that productivity as a secure productivity protocol. So when as an incubator, as a home for emerging technology companies, It's our job to make sure that all of our startups and scale-ups are secure by design, that they go into things saying, okay, security first, not retrofitting security later. Critical thing that I think a lot of new companies and old companies need to probably take more seriously. Secondly, there are new and growing cybersecurity risks. This is an arms race. It is an all-out war. The technology is getting better on both sides, and we have to stay in front of that. And we have to continue to proactively look at what the technology growth is doing and who is doing it, so that we can understand where the threats of the future might come from. Australia continues to face a growing cybersecurity skills shortage. We all know that, but it's not just a number of people in desks that we need. It's the right people with the right training at the right time in the right place. Because without that, we're just heartbeats, and that's not going to solve the problem. So it's not just about getting 3,000 new jobs in cybersecurity. It's about finding people or building skills in people who have, putting them in a position to help build our cybersecurity strengths. It's absolutely critical, as I said before, that we do this by reaching out and attracting talent into the country and reaching down and pulling the talent out of our country. We have a tremendous opportunity here to help build the sector for the future by training and educating and making people aware at a level we never have before. We always talk about the equivalent of slip, slop, slap for cyber. We have not come up with the right marketing term yet. We are working on it. If anybody could come up with that, please do. Jason will talk about that, I'm sure more later on today. But it's that level of awareness that we need to have, that level of top-of-mind concept that we need to make sure that everybody in the country has. So they don't walk outside without their sunscreen, and they don't log in without their multi-factor authentication. So as we evolve and the complexities of this industry evolve, cybersecurity represents significant challenges. But I love to talk about the fact that, and I think the minister touched on this, we're doing pretty darn well, right? Comparatively, we are doing very well. You don't hear very often, well, you probably do, but most people don't hear very often about all the successes, right? The best cybersecurity is the one you never hear of, you never think of, because it's just there protecting you. So I think we need to take a couple of moments, particularly now, at the beginning of Cyber Week, where we're going to talk about threats and vectors and agents and all the bad stuff out there. And remember that there's a hell of a lot of good that's happening in this country right now, and we can build on top of that. A stronger cybersecurity industry is also good for our economy. It's good for the growth of this country, but it's not all about the threats. It's also about building skills and capability that we can take into the future. So some key findings from the Sector Competitiveness Plan that I really want to highlight. Number one, it's about growth and it's about procurement. Increasing R&D funding and spending on cybersecurity and research, absolutely critical. We underspend in this country compared to the rest of the world, at least at the level we're at. Procurement of cybersecurity is a difficult process in this country. Whether you're a government or a corporate, make it easier for people to sell the right services to the right people at the right time. If you're a small business, going through procurement at a large corporate or a government, it's unnecessarily difficult. I'm not telling you anything people don't already know, but we have to do something about that. The safest security is born and built here at home. Importing it from the US or Israel doesn't necessarily make us that much safer. We need to build our industry, our capability, and our people. And it's very difficult to do that if you can't sell your homegrown product to the local companies and the local governments. Let's reform our procurement processes. Let's understand that we need to invest for growth or we're not going to see it. The second is export. Less than half of our cybers export their security services overseas. We represent 2.1% of the cybersecurity industry. We are not the demand center for cybersecurity. 98% of the world's cybersecurity goes somewhere else. We're small. That means we have to be international in our sector, in our industry, in our ecosystem to be successful. Exporting is absolutely critical. Making it easier for our startups, our scale-ups, our small businesses, and Australia is a country of small businesses, to export their products and services overseas is essential to helping build that sector. We need to do more. And lastly, education. As I said before, we have to make everybody aware. If you're in school and you don't know about cybersecurity, something's wrong. Everybody's school should be teaching cybersecurity and cybersecurity awareness. The same way we teach other safety items to students, we should be teaching cyber safety. More kids are online than they are outside, or they're both. So putting a helmet on when you ride a bike, that's great. Put a helmet on when you get online too. And let's figure out how we can make that happen for our kids. We have to attract local and international talent. I've talked about that before. What I haven't talked about, though, is the fact that there is very limited support for cybersecurity startups in this country. We underinvest. We have a community of 285, or was it 87 this morning? I didn't check. Cybersecurity organizations in the AustCyber family. We have another couple of hundred companies in the Stone and Chalk family. There are cybersecurity requirements across all of those, and that is a drop in the bucket. The amount of funding that goes into those startups and those scale-ups in this country is significantly below what similar-sized or relevant-sized countries are doing in other places. We need to invest more homegrown cybersecurity capability. So our mission at Stone and Chalk Group is to transform Australia into a sustainable, technology-driven economy. If we're successful in that, we'll be better off. But if we're successful in that, we will make sure, and we will have to make sure, that we are safe and secure in that technology-driven economy. Technology and ideas are free. They're incredibly sustainable. They will never run out. So we should be investing in those ideas, and in that, we will invest in the future of our economy. So on that note, bang on time, look at that. I would like to introduce some of our panelists to have a little chat today. So I'd like to introduce Kate Pounder. Hello, Kate. Kate is the CEO of the Tech Council of Australia. She leads the Technology Council of Australia, which is the peak body for Australia's tech sector. Kate has extensive experience across public policy, tech, and data, and is a former Accenture and McKinsey consultant. And I think we used to work together. Nicola Nicol, Managing Director and Partner of Boston Consulting Group. And on brand. We had that discussion earlier. Where's your umbrella? Nicola has a purple and black umbrella, just perfect.
I got everyone's brand in today.
Yes, everybody should have one. Nicola's experienced collaborative and innovative leader with deep expertise in cybersecurity and technology risk. She works with boards and senior executives to manage the serious enterprise implications of cyber risk, something we all should do. Online, we have Mitra Binay from KPMG. Are you there? Can you hear us? Oh, there we go. Excellent. Welcome. Mitra is Technology and Security Executive. She's a recognized leader in defining and delivering tech, data, and cybersecurity transformation programs and centers of excellence. And lastly, Jason Murrell. Jason is the new group executive for AustCyber. And recently on a week-long road trip, Jason and I got to spend a lot of time talking together about lots of things, including cybersecurity and whiskey, most of which we cannot repeat here today. But we will be excited to talk a lot about where we're going with AustCyber, what its mission and mandate is going forward, and how we hope to help all of you. Jason has just been appointed to that role as group executive, but he has also had a 20-year-long career with Australian startups, particularly in the cybersecurity space. His accomplishments include helping launch CyberAware in 2017 and more recently CyberHive. Welcome, Jason. All right. How's everybody today?
We're good.
Excellent.
Happy to be here.
Fantastic. We're so excited for you to be here. I'm going to start with an easy question. Whenever I say that, duck. 75% of the companies we surveyed in this Sector Competitiveness Plan said they do not report cyber attacks. 75%. This is a big problem. Is it a culture problem? Is it a risk problem? Why does this happen? Why do companies not report their attacks? Who wants to take that one first?
I might kick off with the answer to that one. I guess for me, the first thing to think about is why, what's driving the reporting. If I kind of go back in time, I think a lot of the reporting has been mandated over the recent years. And if you follow that around the world, there's been regulators mandating a certain level of reporting on cyber. And most of the big corporates, I think, have spent some time thinking, how do I do that? Just how do I meet those requirements, and putting processes and practices in place to actually achieve what has been mandated. And I think in doing that, we've lost sight of the benefits, and the benefits as to why, as an industry, we should actually communicate on this sort of content. And if I think about some of the comments earlier from the Minister as we opened this session, trends happening around the world, and if you look at something like ransomware, if we were sharing earlier and organisations were comfortable sharing and not so much necessarily focused on the mandated processes or even some of the genuine concerns about the customer impact, the reputational impact on their business. But if we were focusing and indexing more on what's the value, let's allow us as a community to spot trends more quickly, then actually we might be able to get ahead of these things a little bit more often. And one thing that struck me in the last week or two that I wanted to comment on is I think this community, on the back of recent events, are sharing and talking about what happened and why. I think every single business in Australia is taking a moment to say what happened to us, right? We're all there. But what I see is the communication and the sharing of information happening at a practitioner level, but less so at the business level. I, in the last week, 2-3 weeks, have spoken to CIOs, CISOs, risk leaders in the second line, who are all talking to each other saying, how do I find out more about what happened? Could it happen to us? And they don't know, and they don't have a point of view on that, because I think that reporting and sharing is not focusing on the upside and the benefits. It's all about the kind of the mandate and or the concerns about the reputational impact that might have. So I think shifting the focus on the benefits is where we'll get some real traction in changing that unreported number.
Kate, follow up on that. So the minister today talked about potentially increasing the penalties for reporting cyber attacks. How do we marry that concept with the idea Nicola pointed out that we have to increase and make more aware of the benefits of reporting those attacks? Who wants to report something if they know they're going to get fined?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, as Nicola said, we have to bring it back to the outcome we want. And I think, firstly, we want firms to be disclosing data breaches and also incidents, because that helps us manage them, it helps us understand them, it helps us combat them. And I think, though, obviously, when you increase the potential penalties, that can create a cultural question about whether in reporting it, you might trigger a pretty extensive legal process as well, and also makes people think a bit harder, I think, about what information they give to people when, whether there's more people in their organisation who have to sign off if they give it. And all of those can actually be almost the wrong instincts in that moment, because you want people to disclose quickly and fruitfully and frankly. We think there's a few things we could do. We've suggested in our submission to the bill that, and I think ASD has also supported this, the idea of a safe harbour scheme, so that if you're reporting a breach, particularly to say ASD for cyber incident, and it's not likely that you have done anything negligent, that you can report that and know that in reporting it, you're not going to instantly find yourself being investigated. And we think that if we define the reasonable steps that a business should take in the event of a breach clearly up front, it helps businesses understand if they're confident they've done it, and then they can report the breach and have that safe harbour benefit. I think that's important. To come back to the question of barriers, I think there is a cultural barrier, because at the moment there's a stigma if you have a breach, and we're seeing some of the companies held up for that. And I think employees, if you look at some of the types of practices that cause a breach, whether it's credentials being compromised or phishing attacks, they're really common ones. Like, often that might involve employees in the organisation. So all of those things, I think we have to just think about carefully in the way we explain the crises. But I think there's other potential barriers, and one of those is that legal question, because if you're reporting a mandatory breach or an incident, it could also be the subject of police investigations, of class action. So that, can all change the confidence of breaching. I think there's awareness barriers. If you look at the Information Commissioner's reports on mandatory data breaches in Australia, what they show is that in general, 60% of those breaches arise from a malicious attack, and about 30% of the time, roughly, it's human error, and in a very small instance, it's systems error. But it's actually the instances of human error that get reported most quickly. I think because usually the business knows it's happened because they catalyzed it themselves. The malicious attacks, it's only saying like 60 to 70% get reported in 30 days, often because the business may not have known at first they've been attacked. They may not know what's going on. They might have to bring in another firm to try and investigate it for them. And then the system errors have the lowest rate of reporting again, potentially because there's no trigger that it's happened necessarily and people don't know about it. So I think getting all those things right, the awareness, the legal framework, addressing those cultural barriers, and then making it easy and simple to report, all of those things are what will drive disclosure.
Yeah, this is a tough one because there's the penalties and then there's the reputational damage as well. So that one's going to be an interesting debate as we continue to see how the government and how people react and respond to that. Shifting gears a little bit, Mitra, welcome. And we apologize for the fact that Mitra's on screen today, but unfortunately, I think you're not well, and we really are thrilled that you made some time for us as well today. I want to talk to you a little bit about investing in cybersecurity companies. What we see right now that there is as I said earlier today, there is a significant lack of investment in Australian cybersecurity industry, and particularly in the startups and scale-ups in that industry. And most companies in the industry consider that lack of funding one of the big challenges to why we can't build from the ground up. What do you need to do to address this? What do we need as a country to do to address this? And what can cyber companies do to address this?
And look, it's a really good question. Apologies for the croaky throat. I'm a little bit under the weather, but I didn't want to miss this amazing summit that you've got this week. So look, yeah, I agree with the results. Funding is always a challenge when it comes to cybersecurity, because traditionally the business has seen IT and cybersecurity as a cost center and hasn't identified the value proposition. So cybersecurity is traditionally not a revenue generating function, and it is, however, about managing risks and ensuring the continuity of our business operations so that we can continue revenue generation. And so as we've seen with the recent breaches, board members and executive leadership teams are understanding now the value associated with their operational and cyber resilience, and they're understanding the costs associated with not having even some of your fundamentals or foundational level cyber processes and controls in place. And so if we think about the cost of the breaches in recent times, we all know the numbers, but when a breach occurs at a bank, account holders can generally get their money back, but need to then be very vigilant around identity theft and targeted social engineering and phishing attacks. But when breaches occur with health data, the damage and the flow-on impact becomes irreversible. Before I joined KPMG as the National Cybersecurity Sector Partner, I worked across the financial institutions. And most recently, my last gig, I was the CISO of one of our largest private health provider in Australia. And the cyber challenges that I've seen across the health sector are many, let alone pandemic hit almost 2.5, nearly 3 years ago. And so the priorities across our health sector also shifted to really be caring for our COVID patients and so forth. Things like IT resilience and cybersecurity was somewhat put on the back burner because we had other priorities across our hospitals. And Claire O'Neill recently said on behalf of the government that they believe we're about 5 years behind where we need to be from a cyber maturity perspective in Australia. I actually believe we're much further behind in the health sector, unfortunately, where historically we've been investing in clinical care of patients and reducing clinical risk, which absolutely is the right thing to do. But the executives across our private and public health sector in Australia have not been made aware of the vulnerabilities and risks associated with the legacy environments we run in our hospitals and aged care facilities, and the low levels of policies, procedures, and controls that we need to run across the environments to ensure we manage the gap. They also haven't been made aware of the imminent threats and exposures related to the data security and how to protect the millions of highly sensitive patient records they hold within their databases and applications. So what do we need to do to address the lack of investment better in 2023 and beyond? What's worked really well for me, and I can see that, it's working well in many other organizations who have this level of acumen and maturity. We need to collectively get better at translating the sometimes very technical language of cyber into a language of risks that the board and executive leadership team can understand and support. We also need to get better at aligning our strategy to where the business is going, understanding the digital transformation journey they're on, and making sure we're seen as enablers and we embed good security hygiene across all operations, and secure by design considerations need to be part of every key business initiative to address any imminent risks that they're going to introduce into the organisation. I think we also, as we've seen recently, need to make sure we're ready for any incidents. It would be remiss of any of our CISOs to think it's never going to happen to me, it's never going to happen to my organisation. The breaches that have happened recently, or in fact in the last few years that we've seen, can happen to any one of us, to any organisation. So not only do we need to uplift our capability and capacity and put preventative detective measures in place, we also need to be ready when an incident occurs, running escape rooms, cyber incident response scenario workshops and so forth, and knowing what to do to immediately address those live threats and reduce the impact to our organisation as it's occurring. So it's really a holistic approach, I would say, to raise awareness and then secure that funding and investment that's required, the prioritisation that's required for our businesses to really address where they're at on the maturity curve and where they need to get to, so that they reduce these incidents, the likelihood of the incidents occurring, but also reduce the impact when they do occur.
And Jason, what do you think? How are we going to stimulate funding in Australia's cybersecurity industry?
Look, I think these sorts of things, unfortunately, are a good way of actually getting investment in. The things like this usually would be in an industry. So Mitch was talking about health, and I've heard Simon speak before about if you're in a hospital environment, your first care is to patients. And so even if they tried to put cybersecurity training through that sort of environment, especially just say during COVID or any normal time, what's their main focus? If you're a healthcare professional, patients first. Yes, I know cybersecurity is important, but is it go through a process to be cyber secure, or is it a process to save someone's life? So there's things we've got to take into account there. I think, look, investment-wise, as I say, currently, yes, I think we're going to get investment and more investment coming in, not just from government. We heard what Claire's focus is, obviously ultra clear now. If it wasn't before, it is really clear now. So I think with this new plan coming out in the new year from the government, it's obviously then the budget in May, we'll see a lot more money there. From a corporate point of view, it needs to be looked upon as something like an insurance policy for yourself. You need to look at it, because it's not sales or marketing where I'm going to invest some money and I'm going to see a return on that money. They never saw it that way. Now we're seeing what it's costing, and you mentioned, Michael, reputational risk. They're actually more scared of that sometimes than losing money. When you think about it from the Medibank one, if they're finding them, what was it, $1 per customer or something like that, in the scheme of things go, $1 per customer, that's not that much, is it? In the scheme, what could they have done beforehand, or where could they have invested? Other people now looking at it and saying, we need to invest now because that cost, the risk reward, and insurance is not going to cover you in every case as well if you've got cyber insurance. So how do you insure yourself and protect yourself? And we've used the house analogy before. We've spoken about it in-house, about securing your house. How much security are you going to put in your house? For your business, have that same thing. Am I going to put cameras up? Am I going to have an alarm, deadlocks, security doors? Go through that same thing with your business. How many layers of protection are you willing to take? What's cost are you willing to put it up to? And then work back from there.
Excellent.
Maybe can I just add one
Please.
build on that, which is, sorry, I will though. But just if I think about the ecosystem, we look at where you get investment in start-up businesses. One of the other things I think we could do as a community across government, business, the investment community and the startup community is look at how we're encouraging more early adoption. If I think about the startups and some of the startups in the room, right, that are trying to break in and build out their business in new markets. Australia is still a relatively small market if you looked at comparison to the US. So how for your investors, do you show scale and do you show those really quick growth opportunities? I wonder if one of the things we can think about, and perhaps as the government's looking at some of the changes in the cyber strategy, is how do we incentivise our Australian businesses to become early adopters, right? And adopt and invest early in our startup community here and show the scale quickly that allows us then to take those businesses overseas.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I find really fascinating is we do talk about regulation a lot, but we don't always counter that with discussions around incentive. There needs to be both, again, top down, bottom up. But regulation is important, absolutely critical. But without incentive on the other side of the ball, we're not going to see the uptake. And one of the things that I'm passionate about is making sure that, for example, large corporates don't pass the cost on to consumers like typically large corporates can do in other areas. We've seen it with everything from the carbon footprint to recycling, whatever it is. It's really important as an industry that we make sure that large corporates and other bodies are absolutely taking care of our data and what's important, but they're not just making us pay for their lack of capability or their lack of preparedness. It's absolutely critical. At the same time, they should be investing in the industry. They should be investing in that technology. Again, homegrown technology is the safest technology. We really need to be doing a better job of investing in our own country and our own tech. It's absolute. Right now, we've got crisis after crisis going on, and the old adage, never waste a good crisis, right? There's something to do here. Let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about something that's been going on in the press and in various circles well beyond before some of these latest headlines, and that is this growing shortage of skills and resources in Australia. There's no easy answer for this, so I'm not going to ask anybody for their easy answer unless you want to volunteer one. You got one, Kate? Kate, go, run. Tell us how we're going to get 3,000 people extra by 2026.
I'm an ex-consultant, right? So I'm going to break this problem down to its parts. We actually put out a report at the beginning of August looking at the tech workforce in Australia, and we were looking at how do we get to the goal of having 1.2 million people in tech jobs by 2030. But in order to do that, we broke down the jobs into categories, and we looked at which ones had the deepest shortages. And what we found is that it's the highly technical jobs, so jobs that require a 3 to 4 uni degree as a minimum. And that's things like software engineers and developers and security professionals and higher end machine learning data scientists. So those jobs are the ones that are in shortage. And they're also, the shortage is concentrated in 3+ years experience. And we'll go up to 15+ years experience. And as soon as I heard about the cyber crisis, I was like, most businesses would probably hear this and think, am I doing the right thing? Do I have enough people on my team? Can I go to an expert consultant? Can I get advice? And I'm thinking, but we don't have enough of those people. We actually just do not have enough people with experience or practice. And I think it's a particularly acute issue in cyber in a way, because Australia's probably been a fairly peaceful country for a fairly long time. And this part of the workforce is not something we've invested in as actively as a country like the US or Israel, for example. So I do think fixing that shortage is really imperative. And I think the fastest way to address it in the short term, particularly for experienced, highly qualified roles, is a skilled migration system. Just because obviously the training time and then the time to acquire that experience is going to be 7 to 10 years. So you don't really have that sort of retraining pathway option for the experienced hires. I think getting that in is really important, because it's those people who build the products, who assure the products, who test the products, who are running the security systems. And if you have gaps in the workforce there, it's just harder to do everything. I think, though, we can then buy ourselves the time to be training more Australians in this field. And there's some really innovative pathways, whether that's traineeships and apprenticeships that are good for reskilling as well as entry-level work. I think getting more Australian students into ICT courses would be an amazing start as well. But if we don't make that first investment with a skilled migration system, we won't also have the experienced supervisors there to train that next generation, and we won't, I think, have an immediate fix in the next 12 months while we're dealing, as the Minister said, with one of the worst cyber crises in our history.
So import at the high end and train at the low end and meet in the middle.
I like to say borrow from our friends. Like, we know that the US and India, within the Western world, are probably the two markets with the biggest pools of this kind of talent. And I think we should be borrowing from our friends in our moment of need while we build up more capability locally.
Excellent. Great. I know there's a lot more to say on that subject, but there's another subject I want to get to. I think that's really important, and I know we're going to run out of time. So I want to talk about diversity in the cyber security industry, because frankly, I think you're right, Kate. We just solved the whole shortage problem, so we'll just move on. Yeah, so.
You're here, we agree.
Awesome, yeah. Anybody disagree? No? All right. Motion passed. I do want to talk about diversity, and it's gender diversity, but it's diversity in general in cybersecurity. We're pretty lucky right now. We have a panel where we have 3 out of 4 members who are not white men, which is pretty rare. No offense, Jason. Yeah, but you could do worse. But what I really want to talk about is this is not reflective of the industry as a whole. Why is that? What are we going to do about that? And when can we start? Who wants to go first on that one? Good answer.
I can start.
Let's go to Mitra first.
Yeah, look, agree. It's very important to get the gender diversity balance right across our organisations, and I've certainly benefited greatly when I've built diverse teams, not just gender, but diversity of age and race amongst others. And you get that collective thinking that's very rich. And I was the diversity director for ISACA Melbourne chapter for a few years. And we developed programs like She Leads Tech and partnered with the likes of AWSN to mentor and support women in the workforce to make sure they have a safe space to share their challenges and obtain the help and support they need to navigate their careers. What we saw through these programs is women join the cyber community, but due to many different challenges, including lack of flexible hours or parental leave, they leave the workforce, unfortunately. And it also doesn't help that when they come back part-time, we don't have the flexibility in our organisations to support job share and so forth. So they're probably some of the challenges we can collectively work through across our organisations and make sure from a gender diversity perspective, the women who are already in our workforce are better supported and mentored and guided so that they can navigate through their careers, which can sometimes be quite challenging. What else can we do about it? I think absolutely we need those real targets that we continue to push and measure against, because it's just not good enough in the 21st century for us to still be talking about this. But we also need to work collaboratively with the likes of Department of Education and Training, as well as our schools, to ignite and harvest the passion of our kids for STEM subjects. And we need to implement more practical education programs to introduce our kids to the vast number of higher education courses and thereafter many different career paths that they can undertake. And we can do this by having more mentoring programs, partnering and supporting programs that are already out there, such as Go for IT or CodeCam organizations, providing more interesting learning opportunities to gain our kids' interest in this space. And I think we're almost too late if we're only focusing on TAFE and the higher ed sector universities, because the kids, the way our education system in the Western world works, you need to know what you want to do when you grow up, when you're 17 years old in high school. So if they haven't already piqued an interest in STEM by then, they're not going to pick those subjects or those courses that are going to then lead them into the path of cybersecurity. And so we need to start a lot earlier, I think, at primary school, even before that, at home and everywhere in between, I think is the right answer to really start to gain this interest from our kids so that they would start to come into the cyber field knowing they've got many different career choices. It's not just, dare I say it, a man in a dark hoodie sitting behind a laptop coding. That's not even 1% of our cyber community if you look around the room today.
Yeah, hear on that. Nicola, I could see you itching to add something to that too.
So I love all the comments from Mitra, and I think, to be honest, all of us could talk about this topic for a hell of a long time. I love that we have the AWSN team here today talking later, so I hope most of you will be staying for that session. I just thought I'd make it really personal for a minute. So for me, 15, 16 years ago now, when I stepped into a role that was in security and fraud, to be honest, before we even talked about cyber as it is today, I was the only woman in the room, as many of the women here have been throughout our careers. And I would just say that I guess my personal goal has been, when I leave the room, to leave it in a different shape, right? And to leave a different dynamic and a different group of people, and think about diversity, and not just gender diversity, but neurodiversity and ethnic background, etc. As I've kind of left the teams I've worked with, my one goal has been always to leave it in a different shape. So maybe just to everyone in the room, all of us have the opportunity to change the shape of the teams we work with and the leadership roles that we're in. Just a kind of more personal takeaway from today is leave it better than you found it.
I can't agree more. I love that. Thank you so much. Some personal action items for everybody to take away today. I want to now open it up for some questions, if there are some. I'm sure there's lots of people with thoughts. Anybody want to ask some questions to our panel?
Thanks for sharing all of your opinions. With regards to diversity, I'm wondering, I've read many articles about the stress levels that cyber professionals face. So we want our kids to go into those professions. What can be done? It's great that we can bring in more diverse people, women and minorities and all that, but how do we make it a more welcoming environment so that it's appealing to go into those professions?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And if I can just draw in a few threads from the earlier discussion as well, I think what makes cybersecurity stressful is that our biggest cyber vulnerability is people. And it's often really hard for people not to do. We know there's a lot of social engineering and phishing attacks, for example, that are designed to exploit human weaknesses. I think it's really horrible for anyone to be subject to that. And it's really stressful if you're the person, I think, in charge of a whole bunch of humans, a whole bunch of technology and trying to make it work. It's so complex, there's so many vulnerabilities. Like, it's a lot of responsibility with little agency in some ways, right? So I think about how would we change that dynamic? And I think one way is we really value the role. We value security and we recognise the complexity and we call that out as a feature of the role rather than it being seen as you did something wrong if one thing went wrong, like recognising that's not a realistic bar. I also think I've really been reflecting on how do you reduce the pressure on individuals to get everything right? And like we were talking earlier about the state of cybersecurity and the sort of composition of the cybersecurity industry. But one thing I note, which is lower in Australia, like only about 0.24% of world VC funding for cyber comes to Australia. Our global GDP shows 1.6%. But the two areas actually we're really good at in Australia are enterprise software and sort of fintech, which I think are quite correlated actually with security. If you think about moving to SaaS or moving to these systems that require people to do less, where more of it's held in a secure cloud and things like that. So I think about how do we take that pressure off everyone in the organisation, whether it's the specialist staff, whether it's the people working in an organisation, to be so constantly responsible for it and limit it to the things they need to manage themselves and then automate as much of the rest that we can. And then I think if we change this culture of disclosure and as you were talking about, get back to more of a recognising as a positive behaviour, like support people who are trying to do these best in these roles, congratulate them for learning and improving. Like I think they're some of the steps that we can take.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more if anybody else has.
I was just wondering if there was any thoughts around how are we able to, as the cybersecurity policies and government is being involved now, have we thought about making sure that all of the new regulation that's being proposed, they're not going to make it more difficult for startups that don't have the funding to have correct cybersecurity posture? Yeah, is there thoughts around that? Yeah, to really make cybersecurity cheap and accessible and fast for small startups?
Yeah, actually, I'll give you a little bit on that because this is something that I think about almost daily. I think we have to carve out some of these rules and regulations and make sure that they're applicable. This is, as I said before, a nation of small businesses. Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, they'll be fine. Doesn't matter what the regulations are, doesn't matter what the costs are, they'll be fine. But the small businesses won't necessarily be fine. And so we have to make sure that we're not regulating ourselves out of competitiveness. Absolutely correct, which is why I want to balance regulation with incentive. The incentive is how we drive more Australian businesses to be used and procured through our normal ecosystem and regulate at the top end of town. We can still regulate the small businesses. We can still make sure that the data is safe and secure, but we can't make it so cost prohibitive that it just becomes a non-starter for a small business to even get into the business, let alone stay there. So I think that's a critical point. Does anybody want to add something?
I can talk about a couple of startups. And what I can see Vaughan there, right? So from a procurement point of view and having done 3 cyber startups and been involved with them, one of the hardest things is, especially when you're trying to sell, and this could go for a long time, so I'm not going to go too far, but the sandboxing or getting trusted users here in Australia, like whether that be big 4 banks or anyone else or larger corporates to try our systems or put them in a safe environment. One with CyberAware, we had to spend 70 grand with Deloitte to go to one of the big banks, like before we went to the big bank, to get put in there, to get checked out beforehand. Like when you're a small startup business, you can't afford that. And we'd self-funded. We hadn't even taken money from outside, but it was using up basically all our money to get one big client, or maybe get one big client, spend 70 grand, maybe get in there if everything's clean. So drop that, make it easier. It doesn't have to be so hard. Starting a business is hard enough, right? Often you're using your own mortgage, you're not eating properly, you're not sleeping properly, all these issues, and then they're adding more layers of complexity on there. give startups a go here in Australia. And we always have to tend to go overseas to get something and then end up coming back here. But just make it easier. Don't put more barriers there. I agree with you. Big business can afford it. Maybe they should wear some of it and pass that on to covering small businesses and startups and take them under the wing a bit.
I agree. If you represent a very large corporate in this room today, think about just giving a free sandbox to some cybersecurity companies that might want to just test and learn and help grow the industry from within. It costs you very little, and it actually does a hell of a lot of good for us. But I now want to just say thanks to our panel. I really appreciate your insights, the thoughts, great conversation. We really appreciate the support you've given us here today. Thank you for your time.